The Office of Curriculum and Instruction recently shared an evaluation training update with colleagues from across the district at Convocation 2016. We'd like to take a moment to capture that information to share it on an ongoing basis through this screencast as part of our series on evaluation. I'm Sonia Tellier, Assistant Superintendent.
And I'm Zachary Wadaker, Director of Curriculum and Instruction for Elementary Education.
So, since our last convening at Convocation 2015, we've done a number of different activities, and we'd like to highlight some of those to set context for this conversation.
Over the past year, the Evaluation Subcommittee worked with new members and returning members to discuss many of the elements that we are required to do as part of being a public school in Massachusetts and the regulations that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has put together related to teacher evaluation.
Together, the team, comprised of its returning members, some who have served on the team for as many as 6 years, and some newer colleagues to the team, crafted language about the use of an electronic data collection tool, specifically the Falmouth Public Schools contracts with the program TeachPoint. And this was one particular area that in our process we were very intentional in developing the language so that we could really look at how are we using the electronic data collection tool, who has access to the tool, and how is that really being used to inform the evaluation process.
In addition to the work that we did with the electronic data collection tool, we worked for many hours to discuss the evaluation timelines as it pertains to both educators and evaluators, and we proposed several shifts and adjustments to help alleviate some of the concern that some of our committee members had.
In some of those shifts and adjustments, one particular piece that we did was we compressed the timeline for non-professionally statused educators or non-PTS educators, so that there's not two different series of deadlines within that. There's only one. We also extended the timeline for submitting evidence and completing the formative and summative evaluation documents for members of Unit B. And we tried to set up this tiering system to do exactly what Zach pointed out, to create efficiencies within the program as we've gained familiarity with it.
As we finished different phases of the work, we shared the information with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, Superintendent of Schools, and the Falmouth School Committee.
Recently this spring, we were able to forward a newly proposed draft to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And when that came back, the feedback that the department shared was largely positive, and they actually cited our work on drafting language around the electronic data collection tool as being innovative and forward-thinking, and they said we were the one among few, if not the only district to go so far to really be intentional in that language.
In addition, we spent many hours discussing district-determined measures or common assessments and how they will be used as it relates to our student impact ratings, which we are required to report to the department.
It's important for us to pause here and talk about why we've included common assessments. We recognize that the regulatory language cites this practice as district-determined measures, but when we took a step back and really considered the scope of our work in the Falmouth Public Schools and the long-standing tradition of setting up common assessments, we realized that the regulation language is really just asking us to continue a practice that we already have in place, while making our assessments more robust and ensuring their alignment to new curricular practices.
One thing we wanted to do was make sure that we were being efficient in our work, and we're talking about a lot of assessments for students, and we want to make sure that we're not over-assessing. So we're trying to find the balance between meeting these state regulations and also having them correspond with practices we already have in the district.
So there are two different factors or measures that come into our conversation about an overall educator rating. The first is the summative performance rating, which we'll briefly discuss. This is the rating with which we've been familiar since the inception of the new framework. And the second is the student impact rating, newer to colleagues across our district, but one that we need to layer on in accordance with the regulations.
So as Sonia said, the summative performance rating is a part of the educator evaluation system that we've been using for a few years now. The summative performance rating assesses the educator's practice against the 4 standards of effective teaching or administrative leadership practices, and those can be found within the teacher rubric that you and the evaluator agree upon at the outset of the plan.
And would also like to remind our colleagues that these tools and documents related to evaluation are available on the Falmouth Public Schools website. If you access the main page, falmouth.k12.ma.us, and you scroll down and click on the link for staff, you can access this and all evaluation documents.
In addition to an educator's practice against the 4 standards, the summative performance rating also assesses the educator's attainment of the professional practice and student learning goals that were established as part of the 5-step cycle.
And the 4 standards identified from the rubric, as well as the professional practice and student learning goals, are all clearly articulated on each educator's educator plan at the beginning of the school year. In addition, one piece that it's important for us to call out is the collection of artifacts and the process of observations. And what I mean by process, when we're talking about observations, is not just the evaluator coming in and sitting in the classroom to observe the educator or sitting in on a meeting, but then the feedback that the educator receives and how the educator takes action and makes some type of either change in their practice or shares a practice that they do well with colleagues.
In addition to these observations and artifacts, evaluators consider multiple measures of student learning when assigning a summative performance rating. So while the rubric information is important and observations are important, also looking at student data and student achievement is important as well.
And finally, you can see listed here student and staff feedback, and our evaluation subcommittee team has spent time crafting language about this practice, and we are looking forward to being able to release that language and moving forward with that practice throughout this year.
And at the end of the cycle, either the 1-year plan or 2-year plan, educators earn ratings for each standard and then an overall rating. And those ratings are one of the following 4: exemplary, proficient, needs improvement, and unsatisfactory.
And what is true in our district as well as across the Commonwealth is that the great majority of educators are identified as educators who are proficient. In one other piece that we'd like to call out in this process, when colleagues think about what information is shared with the Department of Education, because we do have to report on ratings, this word, either exemplary, proficient, needs improvement, unsatisfactory, this is the one piece that's shared. Your actual observation narratives and your evaluation reports are not shared with DESE. It's simply these ratings by standard and overall.
So the next piece of information we want to talk about is the student impact rating. The student impact rating is a determination of an educator's impact on student learning, and it's based on results from statewide growth measures where available and common assessments or district-determined measures.
And as we talked about earlier, we're going to use synonymously common assessments with the phrase district-determined measures. So on an annual basis, this data is collected for each educator, and there are a minimum here of 2 measures. And what we're really talking about is establishing patterns and trends. And patterns is the content. That's what we're collecting, the data points we're looking at. And the trends are the timeline. And what does the data show us over that timeline?
So this is information that we collect annually. It comes from 2 measures, as we mentioned before, and in a moment we'll talk about what some of those measures look like. And then from there, the evaluator, using their professional judgment, will give a student impact rating.
And if you're on a plan that's 1 year in duration and you renew that plan in the following year, you'd still have to look at the same measures for at least 2 years to identify a trend. But more often than not, our colleagues are on 2-year plans, and it's important, and DESE does advise that you continue the same measures over those 2 years so that you have a true trend and you're not mixing measures from different assessments to identify a false trend.
This summative performance rating fell into one of 4 categories, but the student impact rating falls into one of three categories: either high impact on student learning, moderate impact on student learning, or a low impact on student learning.
And Zach and I have attended a number of presentations and listened in on webinar series where it's important that we call out the information Desi's sharing with us in terms of low growth or low impact. That's a pretty rare phenomenon according to all of the studies we've done and again, those sessions that we've listened in on. So low student impact or low impact on student learning is identified as having minimal impact on 50% or more of the students assigned to you, 50% or more of the time. So just as we talked about earlier, the vast majority of our colleagues are identified in a summative performance rating as being proficient. The vast majority of our colleagues are anticipated to be identified on their student impact rating as having a moderate impact on learning, if not high.
The summative performance rating and the student impact rating come together to help the evaluator and educator determine what educator plan the educator will be on for the duration of their next cycle.
So we've tried to model this graphic after the one that Desi has shared with us. And so you can see the combination on the left of the summative performance rating, and then at the top of the student impact rating, there's an intersection. So if someone is identified as being either exemplary or proficient in terms of their performance, but they're identified as having a low impact on student learning, they would be move to a one-year plan and give it an opportunity to reassess the work that they're doing, maybe rethink their goals, and work towards having a moderate impact.
We will go through some examples now of the various ways that people have their plans determined. So in order to be placed on a 2-year self-directed growth plan, the educator must achieve a rating of either exemplary or proficient on his or her summative performance, and they must also have a student impact rating of moderate or high. So in order to be on the 2-year self-directed growth plan, which we anticipate most educators would be on, you need to fall within those parameters.
So here you can see that in order to be placed on the 1-year self-directed growth plan, the educator must achieve a rating of either exemplary or proficient on the summative performance rating and have a low student impact rating. Now, one of the things that we have to call out here is that our practice, since we moved over to this new framework, has been focused on the first bullet in this slide and the previous one, and it's this conversation about adding in the layer of student impact rating that activates this second bullet in the evaluator and educator's decision about placement. One other piece that's important to mention here is that each school district across the Commonwealth has the latitude to add additional parameters to the evaluation language. They just can't take away from anything in the regulations. And so there is an additional way that a colleague in the Falmouth Public Schools could be placed on a 1-year self-directed growth plan, and that's if they make a significant change in their role or responsibility. So if an elementary educator, for example, who had been working as a 3rd grade teacher at T-Ticket, decides to take a position as a 5th grade teacher at Morse Pond, they may be placed on a 1-year self-directed growth plan as they acclimate to their new role.
In order to be placed on a directed growth plan, the educator would have received a summative performance rating of needs improvement. So if overall on that summative plan in either of the 4 categories the educator has needs improvement, and if the overall rating is needs improvement, the educator would be placed on a directed growth plan, even if they had a high impact on student learning.
And then finally, in order to be placed on an improvement plan, the educator, through the evaluation process, would be assigned a rating of unsatisfactory on the performance rating. Again, this is separate from what their impact on student learning is, and this focuses solely on the evaluation, summative or formative evaluation rating.
So we want to talk a little bit about what was done in year 2015-2016 in terms of student impact rating. During that school year, as part of the regulations, school districts needed to report information related to the student impact rating on some educators, and the department gave districts some flexibility in terms of determining who those educators were.
So within our district, we identified a team of non-unit administrators to be the ones to take the first step in having a student impact rating determined for them. So as you can see here, the superintendent, myself, the assistant superintendent, our director of curriculum instruction, Zach, our director of student services, and our team of 7 principals have all committed to this process, and we've identified first year data. And Zach's going to talk to us about what we mean about data.
In terms of data, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education only collects collects information on the people who were part of this first group. By information, what we literally did was give them information by checking a box that said yes, indicating that yes, we are collecting data on these employees.
So we do not actually submit assessment results or copies of assessments that we've administered to students. Rather, we simply confirm for the Department of Education that data was collected by checking off the yes box.
And the data that is collected for these educators are the student growth percentiles related to the MCAS assessment and the PARCC assessment.
And determining, and as determined by the scope of responsibilities for each of the educators listed here, they may be impacted by the MCAS or PARCC scores all the way from grade 3 up to grade 10, and for some of these people, it's a more limited set of that data.
For this school year, 2016-2017, the district will now report year 2 data for the individuals previously listed, so the non-unit administrators will get year 2 data sent to DESE, and year 1 data will be collected for all other licensed educators.
This is important because this is this additional layer that we're working on with the evaluation subcommittee. And this is why we brought this conversation to our colleagues at Convocation to prepare for this additional dimension of our evaluation.
So evaluators are responsible for determining the student impact rating using multiple measures. One measure is dictated to us through the state regulations, and that would be statewide growth measures where available. So if you're an educator starting in grade 4, where they collect student growth percentiles for statewide testing, that has to be one of your measures. In addition to the statewide growth measures, the district then, through the work of our evaluation subcommittee, has worked to identify common assessments either currently being used in the district or assessments that have recently been developed to use as the second common assessment.
So we've worked within the evaluation subcommittee and tried to create a feedback loop with colleagues across the district representing a number of different roles and units. So to identify 2 assessments that would be appropriate at each grade level for each type of educator. So we're going to walk you through 3 examples that we've called out, and by no means are these a limited representation of the larger body of work.
So the first example we have is a grade 3 classroom teacher. Measure 1 would be the A reading assessment, and measure 2 would be the A math assessment. Again, remember, even though statewide testing is done in grade 3, students do not get a student growth percentile, which is used in the other grade levels to help determine impact on student learning. So again, as we spoke before, we're trying to pick assessments that we're already using in the district and not adding more assessments to our teachers to administer or for our students to take.
So a second example that we called out, and truly this example could be labeled grades 5 through 8 because we're really trying to focus on grade spans that are identified by licensure level. But we're looking at a library teacher here where the first measure would be the state assessment, whether it's MCAS or PARCC, for the English Language Arts and Literacy test. And then the second measure would be a department-created common assessment, and that may be common to library teachers across multiple grades or multiple schools, but that would be somehow aligned to the work that they're doing through teaching and learning in the library.
And the third example we have is a grade 10 social studies teacher. Measure 1 would again be the SATE assessment for ELA literacy, whether it's PARC or MCAS or MCAS 2.0. And the second measure would again be a department-created common assessment.
And what we'd like to stop and talk about here for a second is actually feedback that we received at our presentation at Convocation from a couple of our colleagues. One question came up from a social studies teacher asking why the ELA literacy if he or his colleagues are not responsible for the English curriculum. And I think what's really important to talk about here is that /L. It's not just about the English language arts, but it's about the literacy skills that we're providing our students for their college and career readiness. And those literacy skills are, by large part, derived from the anchor standards in the new English language arts and literacy frameworks. And the anchor standards tell us specifically about writing and reading and even listening and speaking skills that our students need across all subjects in order to be strong communicators and presenters, critical thinkers and problem solvers. So that has a direct link to the work that our social studies colleagues are doing when they analyze historical events, when they're looking at a number of primary source documents, or even when they're dissecting a political cartoon. There's a lot of implications. So we need to think about the broader transfer of learning across our subjects.
So what does this look like when you put it all together in terms of determining the student impact rating? This is a diagram that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has on their website and with a lot of their educator evaluation information. So essentially you see year 1, the evaluator participates in 2 measures. Each of those measures, they receive a rating, either high, moderate, or low, based on their impact on student learning. Again, year 2, the same 2 measures are given. The educator again receives a rating of high, moderate, or low for each of the measures. And then the evaluator looks at that information and uses their professional judgment, and then the educator gets their overall student impact rating. The professional judgment piece is really important. It adds that human component and the human aspect to this. And certainly, it wouldn't just be the evaluator doing this on their own without a conversation with the educator. It should be all part of the greater dialogue that we talked about earlier with the summative performance rating in terms of the evaluation process and the observation process. We know that there are certain things that happen during the course of a school year that impacts a classroom, and we understand that and there are some rare circumstances where some of these measures may yield inaccurate data that wouldn't accurately reflect an educator's impact. That's why the professional judgment piece is important to consider.
And with that professional judgment piece, another part that we were asked about in that forum at the convocation was how do we work with the subjectivity to ensure that our evaluators are all coming from that same thought process. And so we spend a lot of time in instructional leadership meetings with evaluators, calibrating their practice and saying, what if this factor affects the data? What if a student group performs this way? What if somebody doesn't meet a certain benchmark? And so we talk about the different contextual factors and the learning environment and the student population. And we really try to calibrate our practice so we can all respond as similarly as possible, though our responses may not be identical.
So now, what to expect during this school year? Well, first and foremost, grade level and department meetings will have a certain level of focus on student impact ratings and district-determined measures or common assessments.
As Zach mentioned, year 1 data, and the data in parentheses, again, we're just reporting a yes or no to DESE. Year 1 data will be collected for all Unit A, B, and D educators, and that again gets shared with DESE.
Year 2 data for the central office administrators and principals will be shared with ESE.
And along with that year 2 data, student impact ratings will be assigned to central office administrators and principals, and that will also be reported along with our summative evaluation ratings to the Department of Education.
The evaluation subcommittee will continue to identify meaningful measures to use as part of the state mandate. So again, we're trying very hard to be cognizant of the work that we already do in the district. For our common assessments that are in place, we're just going to ensure that they're rigorous common assessments, that they're streamlined in a strategic way, and where we have educators who may not have common assessments in place, we'll work with you to develop common assessments.
Members of the evaluation subcommittee will be encouraged to continue their outreach to colleagues for feedback, to bring that information into our conversations to ensure that we are accurately representing our colleagues.
And finally, it's important to remember that as we try to work to meet these various mandates that are presented to us, if mandates change or are rewritten, especially these specifically related to student impact ratings, we're going to come back together as a team to determine the best way to proceed.
So we thank you for taking time to listen in and understand the scope of our work, and we encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns in the Office of Curriculum Instruction.